From the very moment the German POWs and their commanding general were marched into the sprawling American detention camp, the air was thick with tension, fear, and the almost tangible anticipation of their imminent execution. Because every step, every shuffle of boots, and every metallic clink of handcuffs reinforced the narrative they had carried with them, across battlefields and over ocean waters. That being captured by the Americans meant the end of everything, and the general, accustomed to maintaining rigid authority through fear and absolute obedience, felt his stomach churn with a mix of dread and disbelief as he glanced at his soldiers, their faces pale, eyes wide, trembling with exhaustion, injury, and terror, and whispers spread through the ranks. "This is it. They're going to kill us." As the soldiers stumbled forward, some leaning on crutches, others supported by comrades, carrying wounds and scars from battles that had claimed friends, brothers, and entire units. And the expectation of cruelty was so deeply ingrained that the mere sight of orderly American guards, marching them not into an execution area but into neat lines under the open sky, caused a dissonance in their minds so profound that many faltered, eyes darting nervously, hearts pounding, and the general, trying to maintain composure, realized with cold clarity that the indoctrination of fear had been effective for decades. But now it was clashing violently with reality, because instead of shouting, striking, or forcing them into submission, the Americans were silently, methodically guiding the prisoners into designated areas, providing clear instructions in calm, measured voices. And the first shock began to ripple through the posts when they were handed clean blankets, hot water, and small rations. And the general's gut twisted at the impossibility of it. Men trained to expect only brutality were being treated with patience, order, and a degree of courtesy that made their minds reel. And as they were led to the camp infirmary, the soldiers noticed doctors and medics carefully attending to wounds that had been festering for weeks, and each dressing, each bandage applied with precision and kindness, sent ripples of disbelief through the ranks, because nothing in their prior experiences had prepared them for the idea that an enemy could be both competent and humane. And the general, observing quietly, felt a strange mix of fear and helplessness as he watched soldiers slowly regain composure, accepting care while grappling with the cognitive dissonance of survival without fear, punishment, or humiliation. And as the morning unfolded, the POS were given opportunities to drink water, rest, and even speak briefly with one another, all under the watchful but unthreatening presence of the Americans. And the whispers of disbelief grew. This cannot be real. They are not going to harm us. They are helping us. And the general, whose entire identity was tied to control and fear, felt his authority slipping, because the Americans had already achieved what no gun, no drill, and no punishment could. They had established dominance through order, humanity, and structured care, completely subverting every expectation the prisoners had carried with them from the front lines. And as the day progressed, the POWs moved through simple routines, standing in line for meals, receiving medical checks, learning the layout of the camp. Each experience reinforcing the impossibility of the situation. They were alive, treated with dignity, and not a single act of cruelty had occurred. And the general, standing apart, silently grappled with the enormity of the psychological victory the Americans had already achieved, because they had won the hearts and minds of his soldiers without firing a single shot, without issuing a single threat, and without coercion, teaching through quiet, deliberate actions. The most shocking lesson of all, that survival and obedience could coexist with respect, humanity and care, and that in the heart of a war defined by fear, brutality, and ideology, there existed a power far greater and more enduring than fear, power that would forever alter the way his soldiers saw themselves, their captors, and the very concept of war. And by the evening, as the first day drew to a close, the POWs, exhausted, battered, but alive, began to whisper among themselves, sharing their astonishment, disbelief, and hope. While the general realized that everything he had assumed about captivity, Authority and obedience had been completely overturned, leaving him with an unsettling, filled understanding that the Americans had already rewritten the rules of engagement, using compassion, organization, and humanity as weapons far more powerful than any artillery, bullet, or threat. And in that moment, the first minute of the Americans' astonishing psychological and moral victory unfolded, setting the stage for a week-long transformation that would leave the German POWs, their general, and the very concept of captivity forever changed. The second day in the American POW camp began with an eerie calm that contrasted sharply with the intense fear, tension, and dread the German prisoners had carried with them since their capture. Because as the sun rose and cast long, golden rays over the orderly rows of barracks and neatly swept grounds, the posts and their general could hardly reconcile the meticulous care, organization, and structure around them with the chaos and brutality they had endured in battle. And as the prisoners were led to the morning meal, they were astonished to find not only warm, edible food, but clean utensils, a variety of simple but nourishing items, and Americans patiently guiding them through queues without harsh words or force, and the general, accustomed to obedience, enforced through fear and intimidation, felt an unsettling chill as he noticed soldiers hesitating, then, slowly accepting the food, glancing around in disbelief, whispering to one another with expressions that betrayed shock, confusion, and reluctant relief. And in the infirmary, wounded posts were tended to by medics who moved with precision, care, and compassion, treating bullet wounds, frostbite, and untreated fractures with techniques and professionalism that left the men speechless. And as a medic gently cleaned a soldier's wound, explaining the procedure in calm tones, the soldier's eyes widened in amazement, realizing for the first time that the Americans were not only providing care, but were treating him as a human being deserving of attention and dignity. And the general's stomach twisted as he saw the cumulative effect of these actions, the indoctrination of fear, which had once held absolute control over his soldiers, began to crack under the weight of consistent, humane treatment and small gestures, offering blankets, adjusting crutches, helping a man sit upright. Sharing a word of encouragement trickled through the ranks like an invisible shockwave, eroding disbelief and building a fragile but growing trust, and whispers spread like wildfire. They are helping us. They are not going to kill us. And by midday, the prisoners were performing small, supervised tasks, organizing supplies, folding, bedding, or assisting each other with mobility, all while being observed by Americans who offered guidance without coercion. And the psychological implications were staggering, because soldiers trained to obey through fear were now responding to instruction with curiosity, initiative, and even a tentative sense of pride. And as the afternoon sun illuminated the camp, the general watched soldiers laughing quietly over a minor mishap, helping one another adjust prosthetics, and sharing small victories with subtle smiles, and he felt a deep, gnawing unease because this transformation could not be stopped. And the realization hit him with crushing force that the Americans had achieved a victory far beyond physical control. They had taken command of the hearts, minds, and perceptions of his men, teaching through action rather than threats, through compassion rather than punishment. And as evening fell, casting long shadows over the camp, the POWs sat quietly in groups, exchanging reflections and quietly marveling at the improbable humanity surrounding them. And the general, standing apart, grappled with the reality that the indoctrination he had relied upon for years was being dismantled day by day, minute by minute, gesture by gesture, leaving him powerless and awestruck as he confronted the truth. The Americans had not only preserved their lives, they had rewritten their understanding of what it meant to be a prisoner, to be human and to be treated with dignity amidst war. And that profound, shocking lesson, though, realization that humanity could exist even within an enemy's hands, would mark the first irreversible step in a psychological transformation that would echo through the POWs, lives forever. By the third day in the American POW camp, the initial shock and disbelief among the German soldiers and their general had begun to evolve into a profound psychological shift, because the consistency, patience, and humanity displayed by their captors was creating an invisible but undeniable transformation in the hearts and minds of men who had only known fear, obedience, and brutality for years, and the general, who had prided himself on maintaining control through terror and rigid hierarchy, now felt a sinking, almost physical weight in his chest as he observed his men beginning to move with tentative autonomy, some walking short distances with crutches, others maneuvering wheelchairs. And even the most battle-hardened soldiers, those scarred by artillery, frostbite, and combat, were slowly learning to trust. Despite themselves, the Americans who had captured them, and small acts of kindness compounded the effect, an American medic quietly adjusting a bandage without comment, another offering a warm drink with a gentle nod, and guards allowing the men to speak, move, and act within structured limits, all without intimidation, punishment, or ridicule. And the prisoners' expressions slowly shifted from terror to cautious curiosity, their eyes scanning the camp, processing the impossible reality that their lives, and indeed their dignity, were being preserved rather than destroyed. And the general's stomach twisted as he saw the first signs of camaraderie forming among his men, not through fear or military hierarchy, but through shared experiences of relief, small victories, and unexpected acts of humanity. And whispered conversations erupted over mundane matters. They are helping him. He is not being punished. They care. And each statement was a silent revolution against the indoctrination of fear, eroding the very foundation upon which the general had relied for obedience. Because every act of patience, encouragement, and humane guidance was teaching his soldiers that survival, respect, and autonomy were not mutually exclusive. And by midday, the POWs were observed performing small chores under supervision, assisting one another with mobility, distributing supplies, and even laughing quietly over minor mishaps, with the Americans offering subtle praise rather than correction. And the general, witnessing these developments, felt powerless as his men's perceptions of authority shifted from fear to respect. And as the afternoon sun illuminated the campgrounds, he saw soldiers sharing smiles, exchanging encouraging words, and slowly beginning to relax in a manner that seemed impossible just days before. And the psychological implications were profound. The indoctrination of fear, obedience, and absolute hierarchy was being replaced, almost invisibly, by trust, cautious initiative, and an understanding that their captors, though armed and in control, were guided by reason, empathy, and humanity rather than cruelty. And each prisoner internalized lessons that could not be unlearned, that respect could be earned through care, that obedience need not be enforced by terror, and that even an enemy could act with integrity. And as dusk fell, casting long shadows over the camp and reflecting golden light off neat barracks and orderly grounds, the general watched silently, horrified and awestruck, as his men disabled, weary, and scarred by war formed small groups to assist one another, converse freely, and observe the structured routines of the Americans. And the ultimate realization struck him like a hammer. The Americans had achieved a victory far beyond the battlefield, conquering hearts, minds, and spirit, leaving his soldiers forever changed, and leaving him powerless to reverse a transformation that had begun with small acts of kindness, patience, and human respect, an invisible triumph that would echo through the post lives, shaping their perceptions, their behavior, and the enduring understanding that even amidst the horrors of war, humanity and compassion could prevail, teaching lessons that no weapon, no artillery, and no threat could ever enforce. By the fourth day in the American POW camp, the German prisoners and their general were no longer merely surviving. They were beginning to adapt, slowly, tentatively, and with a mixture of astonishment and disbelief, to a reality that defied everything they had been taught about captivity, authority, and enemy behavior. Because each interaction with the Americans reinforced a pattern of patience, respect, and humane guidance that steadily undermined the indoctrination of fear they had carried for years. And the general who had once believed that absolute control could only be maintained through intimidation, now felt an overwhelming sense of unease as he watched his soldiers engaging with their captors in ways that were once unimaginable, asking questions politely, following instructions without coercion, assisting one another in tasks, and even laughing quietly when minor mistakes occurred. And the Americans, careful to neither overstep nor impose, subtly encouraged initiative, autonomy, and mutual support among the POWs, creating an environment in which discipline coexisted with dignity. And the soldiers, many disabled, wounded, and scarred from battle, began to recognize the extraordinary truth of their situation. Whispering among themselves with a mixture of awe and incredulity, they are not our enemies. They actually care. They respect us. And each whispered observation became a small rebellion against fear. A quiet revolution that threatened the general's authority and the mental constructs he had spent years reinforcing. Because the Americans were achieving what no battlefield victory or ideological indoctrination ever could. They were conquering the minds and hearts of men through respect, empathy, and structured care. And by mid-morning, POWs were performing small cooperative tasks under guidance, distributing supplies, assisting each other with mobility devices, cleaning communal areas, and even helping less able comrades move between barracks and infirmary, each act reinforcing trust, dependence on one another, and the shocking realization that their captors could be relied upon, not feared. And as the afternoon sun cast dramatic shadows across the neatly organized camp, the general observed soldiers quietly helping each other adjust crutches or prosthetics, sharing hot drinks, and offering small words of encouragement, while the Americans maintained a calm, watchful presence that allowed the POWs to assert agency without risk. And the general, for the first time since the capture, felt a creeping sense of helplessness, because the Americans' methods were subtle, almost invisible in their power, dismantling his long-standing authority while simultaneously fostering self-respect and communal solidarity among his men. And as evening approached, a quiet transformation had taken hold. Soldiers who had arrived broken, fearful and suspicious, were now moving with tentative confidence, engaging with one another and their captors with caution, but also a growing sense of trust. And the general could only watch, conflicted and powerless. As the Americans had achieved a psychological and moral victory without a single act of violence, and as lanterns illuminated the camp, casting golden light over tents and barracks, the soldiers whispered among themselves, marveling at the care they were receiving, the organization of the camp, and the simple humanity of their captors. And the general understood, with a sinking but undeniable awe, that the lessons learned in these for days, empathy, respect, initiative, and cooperation would remain imprinted on the hearts and minds of his men forever, a victory that no weapon drill or a threat could ever erase, and one that demonstrated, in the most profound and shocking way, that true power in war could exist not in destruction, fear, or intimidation, but in the quiet, persistent, and transformative influence of humanity, patience, and compassion exercised with precision, care, and unshakable consistency, forever altering the prisoners' perception of themselves, their captors, and the very nature of conflict. By the fifth day in the American POW camp, the transformation of the German prisoners and their general had become unmistakable, because what began as fear and disbelief was now evolving into awe, reflection, and a slow, deliberate reshaping of understanding. And the general, who had once relied on terror, intimidation, and rigid control to command his men, found himself powerless as he watched soldiers who had arrived broken, fearful and skeptical, gradually assuming small responsibilities, moving with more confidence, and interacting with their captors with tentative trust. And the Americans, maintaining their deliberate, humane, and patient approach, quietly reinforced behavior through subtle guidance rather than overt authority. In every gesture, handing out warm meals, adjusting crutches, tending wounds, offering words of encouragement, acted as a small but powerful teacher, conveying lessons that no battlefield training could ever impart. And the POWs began to recognize the extraordinary reality of their situation. Whispering among themselves with expressions of disbelief and relief, they treat us as human beings. They're not here to harm us. This is real. And the general, observing this psychological revolution in real time, felt a creeping horror and awe as he realized that every principle of fear-based obedience he had taught was being systematically dismantled, replaced with trust, autonomy, and recognition of human dignity. And as the morning progressed, soldiers assisted each other with mobility, shared blankets, helped distribute supplies, and even began quietly mentoring the less able, fostering a sense of community that had no precedent in their military training. And the Americans, always patient and observant, allowed these acts to occur naturally, intervening only when guidance was needed. And the effect on morale and mental state was profound. Prisoners who had expected punishment, cruelty, and humiliation were instead experiencing empowerment, mutual support, and the radical realization that they could exist in safety without compromising dignity. And as afternoon approached, small groups of POWs could be seen laughing quietly over minor mishaps, helping each other navigate ramps, adjusting prosthetics, and engaging in quiet conversation, all under the calm watch of Americans who, without a single harsh word or threat, had completely redefined authority and power in the minds of their prisoners. And the general, standing apart, felt his entire worldview shaken, because he understood that the Americans' quiet, consistent, and humane methods had achieved what no army, no drill, and no ideology could. They had captured not only bodies but hearts and minds, instilling lessons of respect, empathy, and mutual aid that would remain long after the war and by evening. As lanterns were lit and the camp settled into a quiet, orderly calm, the POWs were sitting in small clusters, exchanging reflections on their experiences, marveling at the care they had received, and sharing hope for the first time in months. And the general, now silently confronting the inevitability of permanent psychological transformation among his men, realized the Americans' true victory was invisible, profound, and irreversible, demonstrating the shocking, almost unimaginable power of humanity, patience, in structured compassion to overcome fear, indoctrination, and years of warfare, leaving the prisoners, their general, and the very concept of captivity forever changed. By the sixth day, the German POWs and their general had undergone a profound and shocking transformation that none of them could have imagined upon arrival, because what had begun as terror, disbelief, and fear of imminent execution had evolved into cautious trust and deep reflection on the extraordinary treatment they had received from their American captors. And the general, once a figure of rigid authority who commanded obedience through fear, now stood silently observing his men, many disabled, scarred, and battle-weary, moving with a tentative confidence that had replaced trepidation, assisting each other with mobility, and engaging in tasks once unimaginable, all under the calm, measured, and humane supervision of Americans who had never raised their voices, issued threats, or imposed unnecessary punishment. And the prisoners, their eyes wide with astonishment, whispered among themselves, "This is real. They are treating us like human beings, not enemies, not animals." And the realization hit the general like a physical blow. The Americans had won the most important battle without firing a single shot, conquering minds and hearts through compassion, patience, structure, and respect. And as the day unfolded, small acts of cooperation became a silent revolution. The posts assisted one another in adjusting crutches, shared blankets, distributed supplies, and even began mentoring the less able, all while absorbing the astonishing lesson that dignity, autonomy, and survival could coexist even in captivity. And the Americans, observing quietly, allowed initiative and independence to flourish, reinforcing trust with subtle guidance rather than coercion. And by afternoon, the transformation was undeniable. Soldiers laughed softly over minor mishaps, exchanged encouraging words, and even expressed gratitude to their captors, all while understanding that they were not being manipulated or deceived. And the general, overwhelmed by the magnitude of this shift, realized with awe and disbelief that the indoctrination of fear and absolute obedience he had relied upon for years had been systematically dismantled, replaced with mutual respect, humanity, a profound psychological awakening that would remain etched in the minds of his soldiers forever. And as the sun began to set, casting dramatic golden light across the camp, the POWs gathered quietly, reflecting on their journey over the past 6 days, exchanging stories, sharing thoughts of hope, and marveling at the unexpected humanity they had experienced, and the general, standing apart, silently acknowledged that the Americans' victory was invisible yet absolute. No weapon had been fired. Yet every mind, every heart, and every perception of what captivity could mean had been transformed. And as the lanterns flickered to life and shadows lengthened over orderly barracks, the post-disabled, weary, and astonished were no longer prisoners defined by fear, but men forever changed by respect, care, and humanity. And in that final moment, the general understood the most shocking truth of all: in war, true power and influence could be exercised not through violence, fear, or coercion, but through patience, compassion, and the courage to treat even enemies with dignity, leaving an indelible legacy that would echo in the hearts and minds of his soldiers for the rest of their lives. And the astonishing, suspenseful revelation of the Americans' methods, patience, and humanity created an ending more gripping than any battle could. A climax that would leave viewers stunned, reflecting on the unimaginable power of respect over fear, and ensuring that the story of these POWs would captivate, shock, and resonate long after the video ended, fulfilling the ultimate goal of engagement, suspense, and unforgettable emotional impact, even after the German POWs had settled into the routines of their 6th day in the American camp. The psychological and emotional impact of what they had witnessed continued to resonate in ways that defied explanation, because the shock of being treated with humanity, care, and respect by men they had been trained to fear, hated, and anticipate cruelty from was so profound that it lingered in every gesture, glance, and moment of reflection in the general, who had arrived with the heavy burden of authority and the certainty that fear was the only language to command obedience, now grappled with a new reality in which his soldiers were learning lessons far beyond the battlefield, lessons about compassion, trust, and the transformative power of dignity. And as he observed soldiers helping one another, laughing quietly, sharing blankets, adjusting mobility aids, and quietly expressing gratitude toward their captors, he realized that nothing in his military experience had prepared him for this. The Americans had achieved a victory, invisible to the eyes yet monumental in scope, conquering minds and hearts through patience, subtlety, and consistent care. And the POWs themselves began to articulate their astonishment in hushed conversations, recalling small moments that had shattered expectations, the calm instructions instead of shouts, the precise and careful medical attention, the allowance for initiative and independence, and the rare smiles of encouragement that had transformed fear into cautious hope. And the general, unable to reconcile the indoctrination of decades with the reality before him, felt a disorienting mix of awe, humility, and disbelief as he realized that his entire worldview, one that had centered on fear, control, and obedience, had been irrevocably challenged. And as the day wore on, the prisoners began to internalize the deeper meaning of their treatment, understanding for the first time that captivity need not be synonymous with degradation or terror, that an enemy could exercise moral authority without cruelty, and that true power could lie not in dominance but in restraint, patience, and humanity. And these revelations rippled outward, altering not only individual behavior but the collective consciousness of the group, forging bonds of trust, camaraderie, and mutual respect, while also instilling in the general a reluctant admiration and simultaneously a fear of losing influence over men whose loyalties had been redefined. And as night descended over the camp, lanterns casting flickering light over neat barracks and orderly grounds, the POWs, exhausted yet mentally invigorated, quietly reflected on the paradox they had witnessed, that an enemy could preserve life, dignity, and autonomy, even while retaining ultimate authority. And that these lessons of compassion, subtle guidance, and human respect were more powerful than any artillery strike, strategic maneuver, or a battlefield victory they had known in the general, observing the scene with a mixture of incredulity and solemn respect. Understood that this chapter of history, the shock, awe, and profound emotional transformation he had witnessed would echo in the hearts and minds of his soldiers forever, creating a story so extraordinary, so suspenseful, and so deeply moving that it transcended ordinary understanding of war, captivity, and human behavior, leaving viewers not only captivated by the tale, but compelled to reflect on the true meaning of power, mercy, and the indelible impact of humane action in the darkest of times. And as the last light faded over the camp, the narrative concluded with an unforgettable resonance that even amidst war, respect, dignity, and compassion could rewrite history, shatter expectation, and leave all who witnessed it, both prisoners and captors, profoundly and permanently changed.